one of my co-authors will be presenting in the second half of this presentation. But I would like to acknowledge the co-authors on this presentation. Sian is sitting in the room, as is Jenny, and she'll take over after me. And our colleague Selby Coxon, who's part of the Art and Design School at Monash University. So you've heard a little bit at this meeting already about the World Health Organisation's concept of an age-friendly city. And our group wants to take this perhaps one step further and broaden the concept a little bit and look at the question of how an age-friendly city and community can support health, but also support safe mobility and active ageing. So that's the focus of this presentation, and we're partway into a project, in the early stages of a project, and Jenny's going to pick up from my context setting to describe how we're going to try and tackle that very question. This is very much, safe transportation is very much a global health, public health issue. And we're reminded of this in the UN United Nations Sustainable Development Goals, which were issued in 2015. Two of them, very fairly and squarely, have put safe transport on the agenda. One of them speaks to the issue of reducing the road toll, halving the road toll across the world by the year 2020, which was a highly ambitious target. The other one has a target for achieving accessible and safe and sustainable transport for all people, but it particularly nominates vulnerable populations, including older adults, by 2030. And coming back to the local context, or at least our local context in Australia, we're mindful that our demographics are many and varied. So we have a very multicultural population of about 26 million people. But as you can see from the heat map of where people live, predominantly they live on the east coast, and predominantly 75% of our population indeed lives in urban areas. When it comes to the older population, it's a little bit lower, so around 65% of people over the age of 65 live in an urban setting. But we do need to remember, and our project will be very conscious of having to be adaptable. We've heard about that concept already across the meeting yesterday and today, because not everybody moves about in an urban environment like you would see in the top right-hand image. Sometimes there are regional settings, and sometimes those much more rural and remote settings that you see in the lower slide. So our group over the last 25 years or so has been conducting quite a lot of work on older road users, older drivers in particular, but also how older people get around in other modes of transport. Now, I'm not going to attempt to bring you even a synopsis of that work, but what I thought we might show you in this slide is really just some of the topics that we've broached, and some of the methods that we use to study those topics. And really they've been very instructive. These topics and the methods have been very instructive in how we've gone about thinking about this concept of safe communities and how this might support older people's mobility. So in terms of broad themes, we do take a safe systems approach. So while we're thinking about how older people get around, it's not just thinking about that person's behaviour, but it's all that they bring to the transport environment. It's also about thinking about the road environment itself, or the transport environment itself. the vehicle, and we heard quite a bit about choosing safe vehicles earlier this morning. And it's also about choosing safer speeds. So all of those aspects make up a safe systems approach, and has influenced our thinking in addressing many of these topics. So let me just sort of highlight a few of them as you read through the list yourselves. So we've looked at driving and walking patterns and specific behaviours within those activities. We've looked at fitness to drive issues and licensing systems and how they might support maintenance of driving. We've also looked at self-regulation and transition to being a non-driver, what that means for older adults. We've also studied the crash stats, as many of you have, and that's very instructive too, about telling us where older people might be challenged in a driving or transport environment. And we've looked at developing and evaluating various educational or training tools, refresher driving tools, for example, that might promote safe driving. And so on. You can see the list there. And certainly currently we're very interested in emerging transport trends and this move towards vehicle technologies that are going to keep older drivers on the road for longer, and the driverless vehicle, of course. There are many research tools that we use and you use. Increasingly we've been applying naturalistic methods, observing older adults in these transport environments through instrumented vehicles. As we heard about this morning in the Long Roads program, we've been doing some of that work as well, using GPS tracking devices, not just in cars, but on individuals to track other kinds of transport behaviour. We use simulation, other observational methods, self-report and survey-based work. We use administrative data, crash data, as I mentioned before, evaluating a whole range of safety initiatives, from changes in a driving environment, in a road environment, to changes in driver behaviour approaches. And importantly, we collaborate on almost all of our project work with stakeholders who can actually take our work into practice and policy, either in the auto industry or government partners who take these outcomes into policy. So I'm just going to bring a few highlights from some of the work that we've done that I think is going to inform this next stage of our work. And so in this slide, this represents a summary of some self-report data from 3 different transport surveys. One based in Victoria, Australia, so you'll see how Australians get around. One based in the US, the Household Transport Survey, and one based in Europe, in Denmark. And while the slide is quite busy, I thought what we might do is just highlight, take the females in the 85 plus age group and look at them across those 3 cultural settings. So in Australia, the 85 plus year old women spend a proportion of their trips, 70% of their trips are made as either a passenger or a driver in a car. And you can look at that blue line as you go across to the US females. It's much higher. I can't read it from here, but I think it was 89% or thereabouts. And in Europe, drops down. And you see other transport modes take over. And I won't go into the detail, but you can see primary modes, of course, are pedestrian and driver, car passenger for most of those contexts. You see a little bit of cycling slipping in Denmark, as you'd expect. We've delved a little bit more deeply into this question of transportation for older people in a driving context in particular, in a study that matches in a quite similar way to the study you heard about Long Roads this morning. This comes from a project called Can Drive and Oz Can Drive, which runs in Canada and Australia, and has recruited something like 1,300 older adults, 75 years plus in Australia and 70 years plus across Canada. And what we've done here, and I've shown you just briefly in this slide, is to track older drivers' trips by a little monitoring device that goes into their vehicle, and it's stayed in their vehicle for now 8 years in Australia. So these are the data for Australian drivers across the first 5 years of the program. And no real surprises in the pattern that you see here, and I've summarised some of the points at the bottom. So as drivers age across that 5-year span so far in the project, they drive significantly fewer annual kilometres. They make fewer trips per year and shorter distances in each trip. Fewer than 10% of their trips were at night, and about 2/3 of the trips are only 5 kilometres long or less. So really short distance trips. Mind you, a trip was ignition on to ignition off. So every time I turn the ignition off as a trip counted. And the majority of trips are close to home, but as you can see in the heat map on the right-hand side, there are some that venture much, much further afield than our home base in Melbourne, where the red majority of the trips are made. So some are even travelling right around Australia and across to Tasmania, as you'll see. But there are safety implications with indeed all of these modes of transport that older people take up. And here there's some work that looked at the hospital admission data, so injury data from crashes involving older people across various modes of transportation, including as a driver, as a passenger, as a pedestrian, as a motorcyclist, and so on. The 4 pie charts represent 4 different age brackets. So the top left pie chart is for the youngest age group, the middle age group we'll call them, and then as you work your way around there are brackets of older age groups. So what we found amongst older road users was that they were much more likely to be drivers and passengers, as you'd probably expect compared with the middle age group. There's a higher proportion of them were passenger injuries of these hospital injury cases. A high proportion of pedestrian related injuries compared with that middle-aged cohort. And within the older age groups, there's an increasing proportion of pedestrian related hospital admissions and a decreased cyclist and motorcycle injuries compared with the younger group. Again, as probably no real surprises, but it's instructive to see where the safety implications are for these various transport modes. And the third piece of information I'm going to bring to you, and I'm not going to go through the detail on this very busy slide, you can read it at your leisure later, but suffice to say this project was a commissioned piece of work from one of the Australian state jurisdiction departments of transport, who is responsible for driver licensing, for example, and particularly older driver issues. What was interesting to us, of course, we elected the opportunity to do this work, but what was interesting to us was that a driver licensing authority whose interest usually stops when a driver's licence is taken away at the end, or when their time comes up to actually renew a licence, was commissioning us to do with a much broader brief on transport. And I think it's interesting because it reflects a real shift in thinking of the way in which departments of transport are thinking about the older population and how they might best serve that population. So our brief was to conduct an in-depth analysis of the literature on a range of different topics, and I'll just read out those topics because again I think they're instructive of the way the Department of Transport was actually thinking about what their future role and how they might support older people's transport. So self-assessment and self-regulation, transition to being a non-driver, My reading glasses on, assisting general practitioners in their capacity to assist older people. Schemes for travel mode and travel mode shift, and incentives to shift away from driving and into other transport modes. And lastly, and interestingly, technologies that might support people's use of alternative modes of transport. And under each of those points, we were able to extract from our critical analysis of the literature some good practice principles to recommend to the authority. So in summary, just want to share with you some of the things that we've learned, not just from our own work, but from other collaborators around the world and researchers around the world. What we know that might inform this next stage of our research. So while the car is still the dominant mode of transport, there is a general shift towards other transport modes. And older adults' travel patterns and transport patterns are different from younger adults. And while many older adults, through their adoption of self-regulatory driving practices, are safe on the road, they are vulnerable, and when they're involved in a crash, they're much more likely to end up in a hospital. At some point, most older drivers will transition from being a driver to a non-driver, and this can be a difficult transition, and has implications for health, their independence, and community inclusion. There are rapid changes, as we've heard, in technology, and this is certainly impacting transport options. There's new research that suggests that seniors are willing to use new technologies, particularly if good training is available and the benefits for them are clear. Partnerships, I think, are the real essence of how to support older people's safe mobility. You'll hear more about that from Jenny shortly. But there are limitations in the current system of our provision of safe transport for older people, and hence the nature of the work that we want to move on to. What we don't know is probably quite a lot, but how technology change will affect safe mobility of future cohorts of older drivers. And I think it's fair to say we have a limited understanding of the nature and extent of engaging in active transport modes, walking, cycling, mobility scooters and so on, and use of alternative modes of transport. While we know a lot about driving now because we can track drivers, these transport modes are less well known and understood. We also have a limited understanding of factors that influence the uptake of alternative transport modes. How can we incentivise these better? And what resources and supports will older people use to assist their safe mobility? What resources and supports are required to assist the successful transition from being a driver to being a non-driver? So that's where I'm going to pass over to Jenny Oxley, and she's going to talk through our collaborative initiative and next thinking in our safe mobility plans.
Thanks, Jude. So as Jude said, I'm going to talk now about our future research and our thoughts on how we can, draw on the WHO age-friendly city concept in order to look at ways through technology or other ways that we can provide safe environments for older people to travel on all sorts of travel modes, but making sure that we're looking at accessible and affordable transportation that's going to support their safe mobility. And that in turn impacts on their independence and enables their social participation and access to community and health services. And it is intended to be a very collaborative approach, and we're certainly looking for networking opportunities. So we felt that this was a perfect opportunity for us to present our thoughts, learn from you people as well, and really talk about possibilities of collaborations. So let me just touch on the approach. Just turning to the dot point over on the right-hand side of the slide, our first approach is where we're going to get some funding and our partnerships. Certainly in Victoria, we're hoping to, we're currently putting proposals together for support through our Australian Research Council linkage project schemes. And I guess this scheme is very important in terms of providing opportunities to link researchers with the industry partners who are going to use the research. So it means that it's very translational and impactful in terms of governments that might use this information and some of our community stakeholders. So on the left-hand side here, this sort of outlines our ideas and our study phases. The first study phase is stakeholder engagement, and we've put that first because we've already started that process of engaging with our stakeholders. The second study phase is really our research phase. We want to gather the evidence base so that we can then start to look at how we can design some effective initiatives. Certainly community engagement, we've heard a lot about the importance and the critical importance of engaging with the communities that are going to be using the types of initiatives that what we're talking about, and that will be part of our study. The last phase of the study, we're really wanting to look to developing developing pilot effective key initiatives to provide age-friendly and inclusive communities that will really support our seniors in providing safe transport environments. So let me start with our stakeholder engagement. Sometime last year, I guess, we organised some roundtable discussions with some of our key Victorian stakeholders, and that pie chart really shows the types of people that we are engaging with, and these include some of our government organisations that we work with, from federal to state and local government and communities. People we know who in the transport safety policy area, the experts in that area, the auto clubs, the auto advocacy clubs and insurance agencies, the auto industry, and importantly some of the peak bodies in ageing who are advocates and provide resources and services for older people. And of course a range of academics, and academics from a variety of disciplines. And I think that's all. The urban and town planners we invited. And we had some invited speakers from the WHO and from our unit. And one of the novel ways, I guess, what we wanted to get out of these workshops was to really identify what are the priority areas that our stakeholders are really interested in. What do they think are the important factors in terms of providing a really effective, age-friendly community conceptual environment. So we employed this novel method called the KJ method. And it's a great method that really enables groups to efficiently, objectively and creatively identify and reach consensus on what we all think should be the high priority areas. But it also enables a really good deconstruction of complex problems. And we know that the issues of transportation amongst older road users is a complex issue. So it enables us to deconstruct that and really look at new creative insights to those approaches. Now, before I turn to the next slide, which is very, very busy and I don't want to scare you, what we actually did was around the table, got everybody to write on little just sticky notes their key, what they think are the priority areas. And they could range from 3 to 5 to 10 areas that they wanted to identify or wanted to put onto the table that they think were priority areas. So here we go. Here is our sticky notes. So you can see there's a lot there, and what the KJ method does is we try to cluster them in thematic clusters. So really what has come out of this, we think, and I'll turn to the next slide, is the consensus was that the most important people amongst, the most important theme amongst these stakeholders was really understanding how we can support a successful transition from driving to non-driving. And we've listed here the key themes within that overarching problem that we thought were the key issues that we should be addressing. And they really fell into two areas. So what we need to look at in terms of policies and programs to raise awareness and acceptability, use of alternative transport options. And these are things like making sure that all groups, all policies and all levels of government, we're integrating healthy ageing concepts. We're looking at educational programs that don't just look at continuing to drive as long as it's safe to, but incorporating strategies to plan ahead for that time that there is a transition from driving to non-driving, and use of alternative transport options to mitigate some of the potentially negative consequences of this transition. And as Jude mentioned before, the licensing systems, there is starting to be a real shift in our licensing organisations to say it's not just about licensing, it's about supporting our older road users and providing resources to assist that transition. And the other areas that are of importance is providing a more of that physical environment in terms of enhanced infrastructure, enhanced built environments and technologies to promote the engagement in active travel modes and provide a safe environment for people to travel. And these includes things like improved land use, spatial design, planning spatial design of the environment and to create safer environments. So talking about walkable environments, cyclable environments, environments that will support use of mobility scooters, for example. And also measures to improve the connectivity of the facilities. And also we've heard earlier today and yesterday, we really need improved access to and from public transport options. So the next phase of the study is really the research phase, I think, in providing that evidence base on which we then can really understand what people are doing, what types of transport options are people engaging with. And as Jude said, we know a lot about driving, but we know very, very little about the details of how people are getting around in terms of walking, cycling, using other forms of transport. So that's what we really want to tap into. How are people getting around? So we want to undertake some tracking of people using all forms of transport. And so our process at the moment is really identifying what's out there in terms of how we can effectively track different modes of transport, and maybe even developing our own apps. So we're really using GPS, Wi-Fi and geospatial data, so that will be collected using maybe a range of techniques, maybe smartphones, but given that not too many older people use smartphones, maybe that's not the best way. So we're still in the process of deciding what those best technologies are. So we've got really good, objective, detailed information about travel. And we want to also support that objective data with self-report, travel and activity diaries, and this will give us more information about the purpose of the trips, the reasons for undertaking the trips, challenges that people have and the like. And we also want to collect some additional demographic and health data, and also information on some of the challenges that people are experiencing in using different travel modes. The third part of the study is looking at engaging with our communities. As we said, that we feel that that's the most important aspect. But we think we've come up with a little bit more of a novel way, I guess, of engaging the community and getting them to think a little bit more outside the box, I guess. So we've taken on an approach that's really used by art and design, and particularly industrial design, and it's called a design thinking workshop. And it's a really an innovative way to look at problem solving and really focusing on reframing people's approaches and ideas about designing an age-friendly community transport system. And it's really looking at through structured exercises and designing designing environments. And it really taps into a collective knowledge of the participants, working in small groups, sharing and reflecting and creating ideas to provide concepts. So hopefully this will lead, we've used these concepts before, and they do really lead to thinking out of the box, conceptual ideas to enhance anything that we think is important in terms of age-friendly cities. And it could be behavioural, environmental, or communication or policy development. Our participants will include our key stakeholders, community groups and the end users, the seniors themselves, and groups of researchers. So just to touch a little bit on some of the components of the design thinking workshops, the first thing we do is empathy mapping. And it's really charting an individual person's sensitivities and their experiences around them. So for example, we might say we've got an older person who might have some impairments or difficulties or challenges in getting around, and really going into depth into what the pains and challenges they have in, for instance, alighting trains, getting off trains, sitting on trains, accessing trains, and what's going on in terms of the challenges that they have, plus also the good things about travelling in these sorts of environments as well. And then we look at the whole journey mapping, and it's really detailing and plotting of all of the issues and impediments and good things that a person with particular attributes might meet on their journey. So right through from accessing a travel mode to egressing and moving on to another travel mode. And then out of all of this, we get together and using a whole range of props for the groups, we really capture some really quite amazing conceptual solutions. And you know, I've experienced these sorts of design workshops, and they really are quite innovative and getting your creative juices going, and we really do come up with some really interesting conceptual designs. So the last phase of our study is to then develop up some initiatives, pilot them, engage with the local community, a local council and its community members, implement the selected design concepts, and of course undertake a process and or outcome evaluation. So through stakeholder interviews, end user surveys, and again some travel and activity data collection. So that's where we're at with our thoughts of our future projects. And I guess I just want to finish off with touching on some discussion questions. Have we got some time to just go through these? Yep, okay. So as we said, we're really looking for ideas, any improvements that we can make in terms of how do we approach this whole concept of looking at age-friendly communities and making sure that we've got it right to design and create design safe environments for the transition from driver to non-driver. So it's all about creating the safe and sustainable and acceptable, the 3 A's, acceptable, adaptable and accessible transport options. And I guess to make sure that it's for our current seniors, but it's also for our future cohorts. So it needs to be really sustainable options in terms of getting around. And as Jude said, we are expecting some shifts in travel modes and emerging changes in private transport. So how do we accommodate those expected shifts? And how can we create these environments with that priority on that successful transition from driver to non-driver? We talk about it being a very negative aspect of transport, but there are successes, and we know there are. So we need to really hone in on what those successes are in terms of planning ahead and making that decision in an appropriate way, and making that decision within your community, with your caregivers and families. And really, overall, in order that seniors remain engaged in their community, independent and healthy, and with safe mobility. And as Jude said, we always try to conduct our research in a systems-based approach. So how can we make sure that these age-friendly concepts are systems-based? we need to absolutely have our partnerships. We need to link with other age-friendly initiatives. For example, we heard yesterday about housing. How do we link into what's happening in the housing area and the like, and other areas of age-friendly cities? A systems approach, I think, needs to be environmental. We need to create a safe physical space, but it's also preparing our users in terms of training, planning ahead, their knowledge. What sort of resources can we get out there to impart that knowledge of what options are there for our older population? What's the technologies and resources? What are the right technologies? How can they be designed well for an ageing population? And also looking at some of the political decisions in terms of licensing systems. How can we make sure our licensing jurisdictions are not just looking at the licensing system, but supporting that transition to non-driver? And looking at some policy decisions about incentives for alternative transport. So I think that's all we have. So thank you.